this Bradley Prizes edition of Conceived in Liberty, a Bradley Speakers Series. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us. The war in Ukraine, America's economic outlook, and divisive culture wars are just a few issues dominating the news cycle. With me to discuss current events is one of our favorite guests, Kim Strassel. Kim writes the weekly Potomac Watch column for the Wall Street Journal and is a member of their editorial board. She's a 2014 Bradley Prize winner and returns once again as Master of Ceremonies for the Bradley Prizes. Welcome, Kim. We've got a lot to catch up on.
Hi, Rick. It is so good to see you.
Great to be with you. Kim, as you might recall, you are our very first guest on this series exactly 2 years ago, which marked, of course, the outset of the pandemic. And at that time, there was a lot of concern about the direction of our country, not just because of COVID, but because of political divisions, the outsized influence of big tech, the disintegration of civil society, and much more. And then Joe Biden was elected president with a promise to return to normalcy. Yet by most measures, things have only gotten worse. What happened?
Yeah, I think it comes down to one thing, Rick, which is that the president, unfortunately, didn't follow through on what most Americans thought were his main campaign promises. If you were watching that campaign, most of the country saw a guy who claimed that his main two jobs, his two goals were going to be to get COVID under control and to restore some unity to the country. And if he'd had stuck to that, I think that this administration, the country would be in a far different place right now. The economy was poised, as we know, for a great comeback. And they were well underway with distribution of vaccines. And instead, I think what you've seen is an administration that has solely taken its marching orders from the most progressive part of its party, and really, as a result, spent too much money. Which is the root cause of inflation, took its eye off the foreign policy ball, which has really put us in the situation we are now with a more aggressive Russia and China. Also focused so much on the Build Back Better agenda that it also didn't really stay ahead of some of the COVID waves that were coming. And this has stoked a lot of disunity and anxiety in the country, and it's why we are where we are.
Totally agree. And how much longer can the country sustain this path it's on? You cover Washington, you have for years. What role, if any, should Washington play in reversing this trend? Or is it beyond Washington's ability to do that?
You know, right now, I'll tell you what, Rick, the happiest days I have is when Congress actually goes on recess. Because it means that they can't actually do some of the damage that is what is the cause of what we're seeing right now. Here's some astonishing numbers. In fiscal 2020, we spent $6.6 trillion. Okay, that was a 50% increase over 2019, the year before the pandemic. In fiscal 2021, we spent $6.8 trillion. As you've probably seen, the Biden administration is now trying to lock in a huge amount of those increases and make that the new permanent standard of what we spend in DC. To the extent that that is an enormous reason we have the inflation out there right now, Congress could help simply by stopping spending any more money for a while. That would be the big thing. But as you well know from having lived through this before, inflation is just an economy killer as well. And we're really at a risk right now, potentially, of a recession, given what the Fed is going to have to do to get ahead of this. So in my mind, the biggest thing Washington can do is pull back, but also provide some more pressure and oversight on this administration in terms of some of its foreign policy actions in order to strengthen American security, domestic exploration of energy to help with that. Remember, when Reagan was in power, he also was dealing with an inflation. His answer was a supply side economy.
Yes.
So to the extent that government can stop spending and stoking demand and start taking actions that would encourage our manufacturing base and companies to supply, we might be able to get ahead of this faster.
Seems so logical. Well, let's talk about elections. Midterms are coming. We all know that. The left seems to see the writing on the wall. The poll numbers indicate that they're poised for big losses. Now, look, November's a ways away. Things can change. But if the election were tomorrow, that's probably accurate. They are looking at big losses. Knowing that, why is there this continued zeal to foist an agenda on the American people that just is not reflective of what most people want?
Again, I think it's unfortunately the White House taking orders from this minority section of the party. And but it's remarkable to me. If you look at prior administrations, when they get themselves sideways with the American public, they do attempt to pivot. You saw that with Bill Clinton. You saw it even with Barack Obama.
Yes.
This administration is just refusing to do so. Now they're saying so. They're kind of trying to come up with a new message, saying, oh, actually we're going to focus more on the things that we've accomplished and point out our infrastructure bill that we passed and focus more on pocketbook issues. But that's not really what's happening underneath from a regulatory perspective, and in terms of the president's ongoing attempts to raise taxes, maybe still try to squeeze through some aspect of Build Back Better. And I think, just I'll point this out, one thing that I think they do risk, though, if they do not figure out a way to shift and to pivot, is that we've seen before what happens when America gets a good hard look and taste of a truly liberal agenda. And obviously, I mentioned Reagan before. The consequence for Democrats wasn't just a midterm election loss. It was a shift across the country of politics that lasted for a generation, Reagan Democrats. And there's a long discussion to be had there about whether or not there's anyone in the Republican Party that has the ability to kind of continue seeing that through. But you're seeing some of the shifts on the ground in terms of demographic shifts, supporting more conservatives, in terms of these parent revolts around the country and education. Those are potentially the makings of a broader political remaking of the country. I think if Democrats don't get themselves in a better position.
I mean, to be fair, the left isn't ideologically in lockstep across the board. Some are obviously more progressive than others, but the right isn't all on the same page either. I mean, we've seen a lot of different views on the war in Ukraine. We see different views, including the rise of an economic populism. Do you see these newer strands on the right reshaping conservative ideals? Or do you think it's just a trend that's more of a reflection of Donald Trump and his worldview?
Yeah, before the Republicans, I would point out, just to your point on the left, don't forget, and I think that there's a lot of moderate Democrats who are very unhappy right now.
Yes.
They were the ones that came out and voted for Joe Biden so that they didn't get a Bernie Sanders presidency. And yet they're nonetheless getting one anyway. But on the right, I think you're completely right. You can broadly refer to a certain faction as being on the populist right. But as you correctly note, one thing that's interesting to me is that they're not unified in that position. Some of them, as you say, are more America firsters, especially in foreign policy. You're seeing that with Ukraine. Some of them, ones that concern me a little bit even more, are those that are intellectuals on the populist right who are strongly advocating for Republicans to become the sort of Me Too Democratic Party in terms of using the tax code to redistribute wealth to people, policies that they appreciate, for instance, like having more children. And then you obviously see these strains that Donald Trump really tapped into: anti-immigration right, anti-free trade right. But it's been remarkable to me to see, nonetheless, the kind of reemergence just in the last few months of those who really are promoting more of a kind of free market, standard free market approach, but also strong national security. If you look at the Republicans in the Senate and the House, they've been really, for the most part, united on Ukraine and the need for the United States to forcefully respond. You're seeing some really kind of impressive governors out there who are doing some really neat policy at the state level. I mentioned, for instance, Iowa, Kim Reynolds, what she's doing in school choice and taxes. Ron DeSantis, obviously, in Florida, who's also taking on new issues like how to handle big tech. And one thing I think I see in all of those, a lot of those, is that they're sticking to tried and true conservative policies that we know are good for the economy and good for growth. But they've also learned a lesson from Donald Trump that they need to be a little bit more forceful and aggressive in the issues that they take on. So it's kind of an interesting mix. I don't think the GOP is settled yet, or the conservative movement
right.
is to where it goes, but it's an interesting moment.
For sure. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about American exceptionalism, which, after all, is what the upcoming Bradley Prizes celebrates. There's been some optimism, and I think rightfully so, about the Western world's unified view, a unified front in terms of defending democracy since the start of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. Do you think that this conflict will crystallize and perhaps even inspire younger generations to value and defend freedom? It's so easy to take that for granted. And I saw this when I served in Prague. So easy to take it for granted when you've never known anything else.
I have been so inspired by the polling that's come out, the incredible support. In fact, the number of people who are actually complaining that this White House isn't doing enough. I don't know if that would be the case if we were obviously in a situation where we were sending troops in. That's kind of different. But, I think there's actually been two things, Rick, that have really been eye-opening for younger Americans on this question of freedom in the last 2 years. And one of them is Ukraine. Obviously, I know, speaking to my children, this is horrifying to them because they've never even really had to think about this. And to see these images of Ukrainians whose lives bear such a resemblance, obviously because they do, to our own, and watch this war unfold, I do think is giving people a new realization. But I think the other one was COVID and lockdowns and school closures. It really reminded a lot of people, and was a concept for the first time for a lot of younger Americans, that freedom is not guaranteed. And that it is just way too easy for a governor to just shut down a business and shut down a community, and basically, in an aspect, impose a form of house arrest on people. It was really crazy. So I'm hopeful that that is lasting. We do have these generational swings where people forget, and you can read the history, but it's not the same as seeing it happen.
Absolutely. Last question, Kim. Let's talk a little bit about this year's Bradley Prize winners. As you know, our winners are Glenn Loury, just an outstanding economist who's been very outspoken on issues of race and equity. Bill McClay, an extremely accomplished historian who wrote a great textbook on America's true history. And Chen Guangcheng, a Chinese dissident who has very courageously exposed the realities of life in communist China. How do this year's winners, in your view, reflect American exceptionalism?
What really draws these three winners together is, and I think their exceptionalism is their exceptional refusal to bow to the kind of reigning orthodoxy, as it were. And all of them really are just amazing examples of that. If you look at Glenn Loury, he has refused to kind of give into some of these liberal pieties on systemic racism, and he refutes that just so eloquently with data and statistics and economic reasoning. Bill McClay, if you have not read Land of Hope, anybody who is out there watching this, that is his textbook you referred to. Again, an amazing pushback against this longtime textbook that's been in classrooms across the country, Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. So this is an amazing alternative. And obviously Chen Guangcheng, who has pushed back so hard at real risk, in fact, even enduring imprisonment, to fight for land rights and women's rights, and also against China's one-child policy. These are people who've been ferocious in their defense of freedom and liberty, and it's neat to see. It will be so neat to see the three of them on the stage together.
It'll be great fun, as always. We look forward to the evening. Kim Strassel, thanks so much for your time today. And of course, thanks for your contributions to journalism during what's a difficult time for the industry. We truly do appreciate it. Thanks very much.
You bet. Thanks, Rick.
And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us on this episode of Conceived in Liberty.